Hello everyone. The topic of this week is about pemphigus, an autoimmune disease. But today we only discuss about the overview, pathogenesis, and classification. The term pemphigus stems from the Greek pemphigs, which means blister or bubble. Pemphigus is defined as a group of life-threatening blistering disorders characterized by acantholysis, loss of keratinocyte to keratinocyte adhesion, that results in the formation of intraepithelial blisters in mucous membranes and skin. The process of acantholysis is induced by the binding of circulating immunoglobulin G (IgG) autoantibodies to intracellular adhesion molecules. Patients with pemphigus develop mucosal erosions and/or flaccid bullae erosions or pustules on skin. Pemphigus vulgaris, which represents the most common form of pemphigus, is a rare disease. Although pemphigus vulgaris occurs worldwide, the frequency is influenced by geographic location and ethnicity. Incident rates between 1 and 5 per 1 million people per year have been reported. However, higher rates have been documented in certain populations. Individuals with Jewish ancestry, particularly Ashkenazi Jews and inhabitants of India, Southeast Europe, and the Middle East had the greatest risk for pemphigus vulgaris. Pemphigus usually occurs in adults, with an average age of onset of 40 to 60 years for pemphigus vulgaris and pemphigus foliaceus. Pemphigus is rare in children, with the exception of endemic pemphigus foliaceus, which frequently affects children and young adults in endemic areas. The sex ratio for pemphigus vulgaris and pemphigus foliaceus appears to be equivalent or close to be equivalent. The severity and natural history of pemphigus vulgaris are variable, but before the advent of steroids, most patients with pemphigus vulgaris died. Treatment with systemic steroids has reduced the mortality rate dramatically. Pemphigus is an autoimmune disease. There are circulating antibodies of type IgG. These antibodies are reactive against the desmosomes or the tonal filament complex. The pathogenesis of pemphigus has led to the wide acceptance of the theory that acantholysis induced by the binding of autoantibodies to epithelial cell surface antigens leads to the clinical manifestations of pemphigus, then leading to the destruction or disruption of this tonal filament complex, resulting in the loss of attachment from cell to cell. Autoantibodies against a variety of epithelial cell surface antigens, intracellular and transmembranous components of desmosomes, have been identified in patients with pemphigus. IgG autoantibody against desmoglein 3 are characteristic of mucosal pemphigus vulgaris. Autoantibodies against desmoglein 1 have been linked to pemphigus foliaceus, and autoantibodies to desmoglein 1 and desmoglein 3 have been linked to mucocutaneous pemphigus vulgaris. In the 1990s, the desmoglein compensation theory was proposed as an explanation for the observed correlation between the clinical features and autoantibody profiles of pemphigus vulgaris and pemphigus foliaceus. Although the theory is still widely cited, subsequent data has raised questions about whether this concept sufficiently explains the pathogenic mechanism of these diseases. According to the desmoglein compensation theory, the correlation between clinical findings and initial results reflects innate differences in desmoglein expression in the skin and mucous membrane. In the skin, desmoglein 1 is expressed more intensely in the upper portions of the epidermis, whereas desmoglein 3 is more strongly expressed in the basal and parabasal layers. In the mucous membranes, desmoglein 3 is present in abundance throughout the epithelium. In contrast, the expression of desmoglein 1 is much lower throughout the mucosal epithelium. The interpretation of this theory as it relates to the clinical findings in pemphigus is as follows. Patients with only autoantibodies against desmoglein 3 should have mucosal dominant pemphigus vulgaris because in skin, desmoglein 1 compensates for the loss of desmoglein 3. In the mucous membrane, the expression of desmoglein 1 is insufficient for compensation. Patients with only autoantibodies against desmoglein 1 should have pemphigus foliaceus, superficial skin blistering, and no mucous membrane involvement because autoantibodies against desmoglein 1 result in separation of cells in the superficial epithelium, but not in the deeper epithelium, where desmoglein 3 compensates well for desmoglein 1 dysfunction. The mucous membranes are spared due to the high levels of desmoglein 3 and relatively low levels of desmoglein 1 expressed in mucosa. Patients with both autoantibodies against desmoglein 1 and 3 should have mucocutaneous pemphigus vulgaris because dysfunction of both desmoglein prevents the ability of these glycoproteins to compensate for one another, resulting in a loss of cell-cell adhesion in both skin and mucous membrane. However, it is likely that the pathogenesis of pemphigus is more complex than this model predicts. Discordance between the clinical and serologic profiles. For example, patients with pemphigus foliaceus who have autoantibodies against desmoglein 3, patients with mucosal pemphigus vulgaris who have autoantibodies against desmoglein 1, and patients with pemphigus who have neither autoantibodies against desmoglein 1 nor autoantibodies against desmoglein 3 may occur in about 1/3 of cases. About classification, pemphigus can be classified into 3 major forms: pemphigus vulgaris, pemphigus foliaceus, and paraneoplastic pemphigus. In next video, we will go further into the symptoms of each form of pemphigus, how to diagnose, test for this pathology, treatment as well as prognosis. Thank you for watching.